Chapter 7 A Sudden Shock. As I stood there musing over this too perfect triumph of man, the full moon, yellow and gibbous, came up and out of an overflow of silver light in the northeast. The bright little figures ceased to move about below. A noiseless owl flittered by, and I shivered with a chill of the night. I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for a building I knew, then my eye traveled along the figure of the white sphinx upon the pedestal of bronze, growing distant as the light of the rising moon grew brighter. I could see the silver birch against it. There was a tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was the little lawn. I looked at the lawn again. A queer doubt chilled my complacency. No, said I, stouted to myself. That was not the lawn. But it was the lawn, for the white, lipreous face of the sphinx was towards it. Can you imagine what I felt as this conviction came home to me? But you cannot. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across my face, came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. The bare thought of it was actually physical sensation. I could feel it grip me by the throat and stop my breathing. In another moment I was in a passing of fear, and running with great leaping stride down the slope. Once I fell headlong and caught my face. I lost no time in the staunching of the blood, but jumped up and ran on, with a warm trickle down my cheek and chin. But all the time I ran I was saying to myself, they have moved it a little, pushed it under the bushes, out of the way. Nevertheless, I ran with all my might, all the time, with certainty that something comes with excessive dread. I knew that such assurance was folly, knew instinctively that the machine was removed out of my reach. My breath came in with pain. I suppose I covered the whole distance from the hill to the crest to the little lawn, 2 miles perhaps, in 10 minutes. And I am not a young man. I cursed aloud as I ran, at my confident folly in leaving the machine, wasting good breath thereby. I cried aloud, and none answered. Not a creature seemed to be stirring in that moonlit world. When I reached the lawn, my worst fears were realized. Not a trace of the thing had to be seen. I felt faint and cold when I faced the empty space among that black tangle of bushes. I ran around it furiously as if the thing might be hiding in a corner, and then stopped abruptly, with my hands clutching my hair above me towards the sphinx upon the bronze pedestal, white, spinning and leprous in the light of the rising moon. It seemed to smile in a mockery of my dismay. I might have consoled myself by imagining the little people had put the mechanism in some shelter for me, had I not felt assured of their physical and intellectual inequality. That was what dismayed me, the sense of some hitherto unsuspected power, through whose invention upon my invention had vanished. Yet, for something I felt assured, unless some other age had produced its exact duplicate, the machine could not have moved in time. The attachment of the levers, I will show you the method later, prevented anyone from tampering with it in that way. When they were removed, it had moved. It was hid, only in space. But then, where could it be? I think I must have had a crazy kind of frenzy. I remembered running violently in and out among the moonlit bushes all around the phoenix, startling some white animal that, in the dim light, I took for a small deer. I remember, too, late that night, beating the bushes with my clenched fist until my knuckles were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs. Then, sobbing and raving in my anguish of mind, I went down to the great building of stone. The big hall was dark, silent, and deserted. I slipped on the uneven floor and fell over one of the metallic tables, almost breaking my shin. I lit a match and went on past the dusty curtains of I have told you. There I found a second great hall covered in cushions, upon which perhaps a score or so the little people were simpling. I had no doubt they found my second appearance strange enough, coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness with inarticulate noises and the sputter and flare of a match, for they had forgotten about matches. "Where is my time machine?" I began, barking like an angry child, laying my hands upon them and shaking them up together. I must have been very clear to them. Some laughed, most have looked sorely frightened. When I saw them standing around me, it came into my head that I was doing was foolish, a thing as possible for me to do under the circumstances. In trying to receive the sensation of fear for reasoning from their daylight behavior, I thought that fear must be forgotten. Abruptly, I dashed down the match, knocking one of the little people over in my course. Went blundering across the big dining hall. Again, out under the moonlight, I heard cries of terror and their little feet running and stumbling this way and that. I do not remember all that I did as the moon crept up in the sky. I suppose it was the unexpected nature of my loss that maddened me. I felt hopeless, cut off from my own kind, a strange animal in an unknown world. I must have raved to and fro, screaming and crying upon God and fate. I have a memory of horrible fatigue as the long night and despair wore away, of looking in this impossible place and that, of groping among moonlit ruins and touching strange creatures in the black shadows, at last of lying on the ground near the Sphinx and weeping with absolute wretchedness, even anger at the folly of leaving the machine having leaked upon my strength. I had nothing left but misery. Then I slept and woke again in full day, and a couple of sparrows were hopping round me on the turf within reach of my arm. I sat up in the freshness of the morning, trying to remember how I had got there, and why I had such a profound sense of despair and desperation. Then things came clear in my mind. With the plain, reasonable daylight, I could look upon my circumstances fairly in the face. I saw the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. Suppose the worst, I said. Suppose the machine altogether lost, perhaps destroyed. It behooves me to be calm and patient, to learn the way of the people, to get a clear idea of the method of my loss, the means of getting materials, tools, so that in the end perhaps I may make another. And that would be my only hope. A poor hope, perhaps, but better than despair. After all, it was a beautiful and curious world. But probably the machine had only been taken away, since I must be calm and patient, find its hiding place, and recover it by force or cunning. And with that, I scrambled to my feet and looked about me, wondering where I could bathe. I felt weary, stiff, and travel-soiled. The freshness of the morning made me desire an equal freshness. I had exhausted my emotion, indeed, as I went about my business. I found myself wondering at my intense excitement overnight. I made a careful examination of the ground about the little lawn. I wasted some time in futile questionings, conveyed as well as I was able to such of the little people as came by. They all failed to understand my gestures. Some were simply stolid, some thought it was a jest and laughed at me. I had the hardest task in the world to keep my hands off their pretty laughing faces. It was a foolish impulse, but the devil begotten of fear and blind anger was ill-curbed and still eager to take advantage of my perplexity. The turf head gave better counsel. I found a grove rift in it about midway between the pedestal and the Sphinx. The marks of my feet were on arrival. I struggled with the overturned machine. There were no signs of removal about, but queer narrow footprints, like those I could imagine by a sloth. This direction my closer attention to the pedestal. It was, as I think I have said, of bronze, but not a mere block, but highly decorated with deep frame panels on the other side. I went and raped on these. The pedestal was hollow. Examining the panels with care, I found them discontinuous with the frames. There were no handles or keyholes. The pots of the panels, if there were doors, as I supposed, opened from within. One thing was clear enough in my mind. It took no very great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside the pedestal, but how it got there was a different problem. I saw the heads of two orange-clad people coming through the bushes under some blossom-covered apple trees toward me. I turned, smiling, to them, and beckoned them to me. They came, and then, pointing to the bronze pedestal, I tried to intimidate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture towards this, they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were used to grossly improper gesture to a delicate-minded woman. It is how she would look. They went off as they had received the last possible insult. I tried a sweet-looking chap in white next, with exactly the same result. Somehow, this manner made me feel ashamed of myself, but as you know, I wanted the time machine, and I tried him once again. As he turned off, like the others, my temper got the better of me, and 3 times I was after him, and had him by the loose part of his robe around the neck, and began dragging him towards the phoenix. Then I saw the horror and repugnance of his face, and then all of a sudden I let him go. But I was not beaten yet. I banged my fist on the bronze paddles. I thought I heard something stir inside. To be explicit, I thought I heard a sound like a chuckle, but I must have been mistaken. Then I got a big pebble for the river, and came and hammered until I had flattened a coil in the decorations, and the fringes came off in powdery flakes. The delicate little people must have heard me hammering in gusty outbreaks a mile away. On either hand, but nothing came of it. I saw a crowd of them upon the slopes, looking furtively at me. At last, hot and tired, I sat down to watch the place. But I was too restless to watch long. I am too occidental for a long village. I could work at a problem for years, but wait inactive for 24 hours. That is another matter. I got up after a time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes towards the hill. Patience, I said to myself. If you want your machine again, you must leave this phoenix alone. If they mean to take your machine away, it's little good you're wrecking their bronze panels, and if they don't, you will get it back as soon as you can ask for it. To sit among all these unknown things before a puzzle like that is hopeless. That way lies Moment Mina. Face this world, learn its ways, watch it, be careful of the too hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end, you will find clues to it all. Then, suddenly, the humor of the situation came to my mind. The thought of the years I spent in the study, and the toil to get into the future age, and now my passion of anxiety to get out of it. I had made myself the most complicated and the most hopeless trap that ever man devised. Although it was my own expense, I could not help myself. I laughed aloud. Going through the big palace, it seemed to me that little people avoided me. In my fancy, or in might have been something to do with my hammering at the gates of bronze. Yet I felt tolerably sure of the avoidance. I was careful, however, to show no concern and to abstain from any pursuit of them. And in the course of a day or two, things got back to the old footing. I made what progress I could in the language, and in addition, I pushed my explorations here and there. Either I missed some stumble point of their language, was excessively simple, most excessively composed of concrete substances and verbs. They seemed to be few, if any, abstract terms, or little use of figurative language. Their sentences were usually simple and of 2 words, and I failed to convey or understand any of the simplest portions. I determined to put the thought of my time machine and the mystery of the bronze doors under the Phoenix as much as possible in the corner of my memory, until my growing knowledge would lead me back to them in a natural way. Yet, a certain feeling, you may understand, tethered me in a circle a few miles around my point of arrival. Chapter 8 Explanation. So, as far as I could see, all the world displayed the same exuberant richness as the Thames Valley. From every hill I climbed, I saw the same abundance of splendid buildings, endlessly varied in material and style, the same clustering thickets of evergreens, the same blossom-laden trees, and tree ferns. Here and there water shone like silver, and beyond, the land rose into blue, undoling hills, and so faded into the sincerity of the sky. A particular feature which presently attracted my attention was the presence of certain circular wells, several, as it seemed to me, of a very great depth. One lay by the path up the hill which I followed during my first walk. Like the others, it seemed rimmed with bronze, curiously wrought, and protected by a little compulsa from the rain. Sitting by the side of these wells, and peered down into the shaded darkness, I could see no gleam of water, nor could I stare any reflection with a lighted match. But in all of them I could hear a certain sound, a thud, 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 like a beating of some big engine, and I discovered from the flaring of my matches that a steady current of air seemed down the shafts. Further, I threw a scrap of paper into the throat of one, and instead of fluttering slowly down, it was sucked swiftly out of sight. After a time, I too came to connect these wells with tall towers standing here and there upon the slopes, for above them there was often just a flicker in the air as one sees on the hot day of a scorched sun. Putting things together, I reached a strong suggestion that an extensive system of subterranean ventilation, whose true import was difficult to imagine. I was at first inclined to associate it with the sanitary apparatus of these people. It was an obvious conclusion, but is absolutely wrong. And here, I must admit, I learned very little of drains and bells, and modes of conveyance, and the like of conveyances. During my time in this real future, in some of these versions of Utopias and Coming Times which I have read, there is a vast amount of detail about building and social arrangements, and so forth. But while such details are easy enough to attain, the whole world is contained in one's imagination. They are altogether inaccessible to the real traveler. Amid such realities as I found here, conceive the tale of London which a Negro fresh from Central Africa would take back to his tribe. What would he know of railway companies, of social movements, of telephones, telegraph wires, of parcels, delivery company, and postal orders, and the like? Yet we, at least, should be willing enough to explain these things to him. And even of what he knew, how much could he make his untraveled friend either apprehend or believe? Then think how narrow the gap between a Negro and a white man of our times, and how wide the interval between myself and these of the Golden Age. I was sensible of much which was unseen, and which contributed to my comfort, but save for the general impression of automatic organization, I fear I can convey very little of the difference to your mind. In the matter of spectacular, for instance, I had no intentions of cemeteria, nor anything suggestion of tombs, but it occurred to me that possibly there might be cemeteries, or cemeteria, somewhere beyond the range of my explorations. This, again, was a question I deliberately put to myself, and my curiosity was at first entirely defended upon the point. The thing puzzled me, and I was led to make a further remark, which puzzled me still more, that age and infirm among these people were none. I confessed my satisfaction with my first theories of an atomic civilization, and a decent humanity did not long endure. Yet I could think of no other. Let me put my difficulties. The several big places I had yet explored were mere living spaces, great dining halls, sleeping apartments. I could find no machinery, no appliances of any kind, yet these people were clothed in pleasant fabrics that must at times need renewal, and their sandals, though undecorated, were fairly complex specimens of metalwork. Somehow such things must be made, and these little people displayed no vantage of creative tendency. There were no shops, no workshops, no sign of impartitions among them. They spent all their time in playing gently, in bathing in the river, in making love in a half playful fashion, in eating fruit and sleeping. I could not see how things were kept going. And then again, the time machine. Something I knew not what had taken it into a hollow pedestal in the White Phoenix. Why? For the life of me, I could not imagine. Those waterless wells, too. Those flickering pillars. I felt I lacked a clue. I felt, how shall I put it? Suppose you found an inscription with sentences here and there in excellent plain English, and imported therewith others made up of words, of letters even, absolutely unknown to you. Well, on the third day of my visit, this is how the world of 800 and 200 700 one present itself to me. That day, too, I made a friend of a sort. It happened that I was watching some of the little people bathing in a shower. One of them was seized with a cramp and began drifting downstream. The main current ran rather swiftly, but not strong enough for even a moderate swimmer. It still gives you an idea, therefore, of the strange deficiency of these creatures, when I tell you that none made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly crying little thing, which was drowning before their eyes. When I realized this, I hurried and slipped off my clothes and waded in at the point lower down. I caught the poor mite and threw her safely to land. A little rubbing the limbs soon brought her around, and I had the satisfaction of seeing she was all right. Before I left her, I had to such a low estimate of her kind that I did not expect any gratitude from her. In that, however, I was wrong. This happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met my little woman, as I believed it was, as I was returning towards my center from an exploration, and she received me with cries of delight and presented me with a big garland of flowers, evidently made for me and me alone. The thing took my imagination. Very possibly I had been feeling desolate. At any rate, I did my best to display my appreciation of the gift. We were soon seated together at the little stone arbor, engaged in a conversation, chiefly of smiles. The creature's friendliness affected me exactly as a child might have done. We passed each other flowers, and she kissed my hands. I did the same to hers. Then I tried to talk, and found that her name was Wena, which, though I didn't know what it meant, somehow seemed appropriate enough. That was the beginning of a queer friendship which lasted a week and ended, as I will tell you. She was exactly like a child. She wanted to be with me always. She tried to follow me everywhere. And on my next journey out and about, it went to my heart to tie her down and leave her at last, exhausted and calling after me rather plaintively. But the problem of the world had to be mastered. I had not, I said to myself, come into the future to carry on a miniature flirtation. Yet her distress when I left her was very great. Her devotions at the parting were sometimes frantic, and I think altogether I had as much trouble as comfort from her devotion. Nevertheless, she was somehow a very great comfort. I thought it was mere childish affection that made her cling to me. Until it was too late, I did not clearly know what I had inflicted upon her when I left her, nor until it was too late did I clearly understand what she was to me. For, by merely seeming fond of me and showing in her weak, futile way that she cared for me, the little doll of a creature presently gave my return to the neighborhood of the White Phoenix almost a feeling of comforting home, and I would watch her tiny figure of white and gold as soon as I came over the hill. It was from her, too, that I learned that fear was not yet left the world. She was fearless enough in the daylight, and she had the oddest confidence in me. For once, in a foolish moment, I made a threatening grimace at her. She simply laughed at them. But she dreaded the dark, dreaded shadows, dreaded black things. Darkness to her was the one thing dreadful. It was singularly passionate emotion, and it set me thinking, observing, and discovering, then, among other things, that these little people gathered into the great houses after dark, and slept in droves. To enter upon them without a light was to put them into tumult of apprehension. I never found one out of the doors, or one sleeping alone within the doors after dark. Yet I was still such a blockhead that I missed the lesson of that fear, and that in spite of Lena's distress, I insisted upon sleeping away from these slumbering multitudes. It troubled her greatly in the end. Her odd affection for me triumphed, and for 5 of the nights of our acquaintance, including the last night of all, she slept with her pillowed head on my arm. But my story slips away from me as I speak of her. It must have been the night before her rescue that I was wakened about dawn. I had been reckless, dreaming most disagreeably that I was drowned, and that sea anemones were feeling over my face with their soft palps. I awoke with a start, but with the odd fancy of some grayish animal had just rushed out of the chamber. I tried to get some sleep again, but I felt restless and uncomfortable. It was a dim gray hour when things are just creeping out of darkness, when everything is colorless and cut clear, and yet unreal. I got up and went down into the great hall, and so out upon the flagstones in front of the palace. I thought I would make a virtue of necessity and see the sunrise. The moon was setting, and the dying moonlight and the first pallor of dawn were mingled in a ghastly half-light. The bushes were inky black, the ground was sombre gray, and the sky was colorless and cheerless. And up the hill, I thought I could see ghosts. Several times, as I scanned the slope, I saw white figures. Twice I fancied I saw a solitary white, ape-like creature running rather quickly up the hill. And once near the ruins I saw a leash of them carrying some dark body. They moved hastily. I did not see what became of them. It seemed that they vanished among the bushes. The dawn was still indistinct, so, you must understand, I was feeling that chill. Uncertain early morning feeling you have known, I doubted my eyes. As the eastern sky grew brighter, and the light of day came on its vivid coloring return upon the world once more, I scanned the view keenly, but I saw no vestiges of white figures, and they were mere creatures of half-light. They must have been ghosts, I said. I wonder whence they dated, for a queer notion of Grant Allen came into my head, and amused me. If each generation die and leave ghosts, he argued, the world at last would get overcrowded with them. On that theory, they would have grown innumerable some 800,000 years ago hence. and it was no great wonder to see four at once. But the jest was unsatisfying, and I was thinking of these figures all morning, until when his rescue drove them out of my head. I associated them in some indefinite way with the white animal I had started in my passionate search for the time machine. But Wenna was a pleasant substitute, yet all the same, there was a soon desire to take a far deadlier possession of my mind. I think I have said how much hotter than our own was the weather of this golden age. I cannot account for it. It may be that the sun was hotter, or the earth was nearer to the sun. It's unusual to assume that the sun would go on cooling steadily in the future, but people unfamiliar in such speculations as those of the young Darwin forget that the planets most untimely fall back one by one into parent body. These catastrophes occur. The sun will ablaze with renewed energy, and it may be some inner planet that suffered this fate. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that the sun was very much hotter than we know it. Well, one very hot morning, my fourth, I think, I was seeking shelter from the heat and glare in a colossal ruin near the great house where I slept and fed. There happened to be this strange thing clambering among these heaps of masonry. I found a narrow gallery, whose end of side windows were blocked by fallen masses of stone. By contrast with the brilliant outside, it seemed at first impenetrable dark to me. I entered in groping, for the change of light to blackness made spots of color swim before me. Suddenly I halted, spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous by reflection against the daylight without, was watching me out of the darkness. The old instinct of dread wild beasts came upon me. I clenched my hands steadfastly and looked into the glaring eyes. I was afraid to turn. Then the thought of absolute security in which humanity appeared to be living came to my mind. And then I remembered the strange terror of the dark. Overcoming my fear to some extent, I advanced a step and spoke. I will admit that my voice was harsh and ill-controlled. I put out my hand and touched something soft. At once the eyes darted sideways. Something white ran past me. I turned with my heart to my mouth and saw a queer little ape-like figure, its head held down in a particular manner, running across the sunlight space behind me. It blundered across the block of granite, staggered aside, and in a moment it was hidden in a black shadow beneath another pile of ruined masonry. My impression of it, of course, imperfect, but I know it was a dull white and had a strange, large, grayish red eyes. Also, there was a flaxen hair on its head and down its back. But, as I say, it went too fast for me to see it distinctly. I cannot even say whether it ran on all fours or only with its forearms held very low. After an instant pause, I followed it into the second heap of ruins. I could not find it at first, but after some time in the profound obscurity, I came upon one of those well-rounded openings of which I have told you, half closed by a fallen pillar. A sudden thought came to me. Could this thing have vanished down the shaft? I lit a match, and looking down, I saw a small white moving creature, with large brown eyes which regarded me steadfastly as it retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down the wall, and now I saw for the first time a number of metal foot and hand rests forming a kind of ladder down the shaft. Then the light burned my fingers and fell out of my hand, going out as it dropped. Then I lit another, and the little monster had disappeared. I do not know how long I sat peering down that well. It was not for some time that I could exceed in persuading myself to the same thing I had seen was human, but gradually the truth dawned on me that man had not remained one species, and that differentiated into two distinct animals, that my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but this bleached, obscure nocturnal thing which had flashing for me, was also adhered to all the ages. I thought of the flickering pillars and my theory of underground ventilation. I began to suspect their true import. And what I wondered was this lemur doing in my scheme of a perfectly balanced organism, how it was related to the insolent security of the beautiful overworlders, and what was hidden down there at the foot of that shaft. I sat upon the edge of the well, telling myself that at any rate there was nothing to fear, and that there I descended for a solution of my difficulties. And withdrawal, I was absolutely afraid to go. As I hesitated, two of the most beautiful upperworld people came running in their armorous sport across the daylight in the shadow. The male pursuing the female, flinging flowers at her as she ran. They seemed distressed to find me, my arm against the overturned pillar, peering down the wall. Apparently, it was considered bad form to remark these apertures, for when I pointed to this one and tried to frame a question about it in their tongue, they were still more visibly depressed and turned away. But they were interested by my matches, and I struck some to amuse them. I tried them again and again about the well, and again I failed. So presently I left them, meaning to go back to Wenna and see what I could get from her. But mine was already a revolution. My guesses and impressions were slipping and sliding into new adjustment. I had now a clue to the importance of these wells, and to the ventilation towers, to the mystery of the ghosts, to say nothing of a hint at the meaning of the bronze gates and the fate of the time machine. And very vaguely there came a suggestion towards a solution of the economic problem that puzzled me. There was a new view. Plainly, this second species of man was subterranean. There were three circumstances in particular which made me think that this rare emergence above ground was the outcome of a long continued underground habitat. It was the first place there was the bleached look common in most animals that lived vaguely in the dark. The whitefish of Kentucky caves, for instance, those large eyes with capacity for reflecting light, are common features of nocturnal things. Witness the owl and the cat. And last of all, that evident confusion in sunshine, that hasty yet fumbling awkward flight towards dark shadow, and that particular carriage of the head while in light, all reinforcing the theory of extreme sensitiveness of the retina. Beneath my feet, the earth must have tunneled enormously, and these creatures were the habitat of the new race. The presence of ventilation shafts and wells along the hill slopes everywhere, in fact, except along the river valley, showed how universal were the ramifications. What was so natural, then, as to assume that it was this artificial underworld, that such work was necessary to comfort the daylight race, was done. The notion was so plausible that I at once accepted it, and went on to assume how of this splitting of human species. I dare say you will anticipate the shape of my theory, though, for myself. I very soon felt that it fell far short of the truth. At first, proceeding from the problems of our own age, it seemed clear as daylight to me that gradual widening of the presently merely temporary and social difference between the capitalist and laborer was key to the whole position. No doubt it will seem grotesque enough to you and wildly incredible, and yet even now there are existing circumstances to point that way. There is a tendency to utilize underground space for the less ornamental purpose of civilization. There is the Metropolitan Railway in London. For instance, there is a new electrical railways, there are subways, there are underground workrooms and restrooms, and they increase and multiply. Evidently, I thought, this tendency had increased till industry had gradually lost its birthright to the sky. I meant that it had gone deeper and deeper into larger and even larger underground factories, spending a still increased amount of its time therein till the end. Even now, does not an East End worker live in such artificial conditions as partially to be cut off from natural surface of the earth. Again, the exclusive tendency of richer people due, no doubt, to the increasing refinement of their education and widening gulf between them and the rude violence of the poor, it's already leading to the closing, in their interest, of considerable portions of the surface of the land. About London, for instance. Perhaps half of the pretty country is shut in against intrusion, and the same widening gulf, which is due to the length and expense of higher education process and the increased facilities for the temptations towards refined habitats, a part of rich will make that exchange between class and class, that promotions by intermarriage, which at present the splitting of our species along lines of social stratification less and less frequent. So, in the end, above you must have the havens, pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty. Below ground, the have-nots, the workers, getting continually adapted to the conditions of their labor. Once they were there, they would no doubt have to pay rent, and not have a little of it, for the ventilation of their caves, and if they refused, they would starve or be suffocated for errors, such of them as they were so constituted as to be miserable and rebellious would die, and in the end, the balance being permanent, the survivors would become well adapted to the conditions of underground life, and as happy in their way as overworld people in theirs, as it seemed to me the refined beauty and elegant parlor followed natural enough. The great triumphant of humanity I had dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. It had been no such triumphant of moral education and general cooperation as I imagined. Instead, I saw the real aristocracy, armed with perfect science and working on the logical conclusion, the industrial system of today. Its triumphant had not been simply a triumph over nature, but a triumph over nature and the fellow man. This, I must warn you, was my theory at the time. I had no convenient securon at the pattern of utopia books. My explanation may be absolutely wrong. I still think it is the most plausible one. But even on this supposition, the balance of civilization that was at last attained must have been long since past its zenith, and now far fallen into decay. The far too perfect security of the overworlders had led them to slow movement of degeneration, to the general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence that I could clearly see enough already. What would happen to the undergrounders I did not yet suspect, but from what I had seen of the Morlocks, that, by the way, was the name of which these creatures were called, I can imagine the modifications of human type were even far more profound among the Italy, the beautiful race that I have already knew. Then came troublesome doubts. Why had the Morlocks taken my time machine? For I felt sure it had who had taken it. Why, too, if the Italy were masters, could they not restore the machine to me? And why were they so terribly afraid of the dark? I professed, as I have said, to question Wenna about this underworld, but But here again I was disappointed. At first she would not understand my questions, and presently she refused to answer them. She shivered at the thought of the topic was unendurable, and when I pressed her, perhaps a little harshly, she burst into tears. There were only tears, except my own. When I saw that in the Golden Age, when I saw them cease abruptly to trouble about Murlocs, and was only concerned in banishing these signs from her human inheritance from Wena's eyes. And very soon she was smiling and clapping her hands, while I sullenly burnt a match. Chapter 9. The Morlocks. It may seem odd to you, but it was 2 days before I could follow up the newfound clue in what was manifestly the proper way. I felt a particular shrinking from those pale bodies. There were half-bleached color of the worms and things one sees preserved in spirit in a zoologist museum, but they were filthily cold to the touch. Probably shrinking was largely due to the sympathetic influence of the Uli, whose disgust of the Murlocs I now began to appreciate. And next, I did not sleep well. Probably my health was a little disordered. I was oppressed with perplexity and doubt. Once or twice I had a feeling of intense fear, which I could perceive no definite reason. I remember creeping noiselessly into the great hall where little people were sleeping in the moonlight, and that night when I was among them, and feeling reassured by their presence, it occurred to me even then that in the course of a few days the moon must pass through its last quarter, and the nights grow dark, when the appearance of these unpleasant creatures from below, these whitened lemurs, this new vermin that had replaced the old, might be more abundant. And on both these days I had restless feelings of one who shirks an inevitable duty. I felt sure that the time machine was only to be recovered by boldly penetrating these mysteries of the underground. Yet I could not face the mystery. If only I had a companion, it would have been different. But I was so horribly alone. Even to clamber down into the darkness of the well applauded me. I don't know if you will understand my feeling, but I never quite felt safe at my back. It was this restless, this insecurity, perhaps, that drove me farther and farther afield in my exploration expeditions, going to the southwest towards the rising country that is now called Combe Woods. I observed far off in the direction of 19th century Banstead, a vast green structure different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was the largest of the palaces or ruins I knew, and the facade had an oriental look, the face of it having the lure as well as a pale green tint, a kind of bluish green of a certain type of Chinese porcelain. This difference in aspect suggested a difference in use, and I was minded to push on and explore. The day was growing late, and I had come upon the site of the place after a long and tiring circuit, so I resolved to hold over the adventure for the following day. I returned to welcome and the caress of little Wena, but next morning I perceived clearly enough that my curiosity regarding the palace of green porcelain was a piece of self-deception to enable me to shirk by another day, an experience I dreaded. I resolved I would make to descend without further waste of time and start out early in the morning towards a well near the ruins of granite and aluminum. Little Wena ran with me. She danced beside me to the well, but when she saw me lean over the mouth and look downward, she seemed strangely disconcerted. "Goodbye, little Wena," I said, kissing her and putting her down. I began to feel over the parapet and climbing hooks. Rather hastily, I might as well confess, for I feared my courage might leak away. At first she watched me in amazement, then she gave a most ridiculous cry and running to me. She began to pull at me with her little hands. I think her opposition nerved me rather to proceed. I shook her off, perhaps a little roughly. In another moment I was in the throat of the well. I saw her antagonized face over the prophet, and smiled to reassure her. Then I had to look down at the unstable hooks to which I clung. I had to clamber down the shaft perhaps 200 yards. The descent was effected by means of metallic bars projected from the sides of the well, and these being adapted to the needs of a creature much smaller and lighter than myself, I was speedily cramped and fatigued by the descent. And not simply fatigued. One of the bars bent suddenly under my weight, and almost swung off into the blackness. For a moment I hung by one hand, and after that experience I did not dare rest again. Though my arms and back were presently acutely painful, I went on clambering down the sheer descent with as quick a motion as possible. Glancing upward, I saw the aperture. A small blue disk, in which was a star, was visible, while little Wenna's head showed as a round black projection. The thudding sound of the machine grew louder and more oppressive. Everything save that little disk above was profoundly dark, and when I looked up at Wenna again, she had disappeared. I was in agony of discomfort. I had some thought of trying to go up the shaft again and leave the underworld alone. But even while I turned this over in my mind, I continued to descend. At last, with intense relief, I saw dimly coming up a foot of light right to me, a slender loophole in the wall. Swinging myself in, I found it was an aperture of a narrow horizontal tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. It was not too soon. My arms ached, my back was cramped, and I was trembling with the prolonged terror of falling. Besides this, the unbroken darkness that had a distressing effect upon my eyes. The air was full of throb and the hum of machinery and pumping of air around the shaft. I do not know how long I lay. I was aroused by a soft hand touching my face. Staring up in the darkness, I snatched my matches and hastily striking one. I saw there, stooping, 3 white creatures similar to the one I had seen above ground, in the ruin, hastily retreating before the light, living as they did in what appeared to me impenetrable darkness. Their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, as are the pupils of the abyssal fishes, and they reflected the light the same way. I had no doubt they could see me in that rainless obscurity, and they did not seem to have any fear of me apart from the light. But so soon as I struck a match in order to see them, they fled incontinently, vanishing into the dark gutters and tunnels, from which their eyes glared at me in the strangest fashion. I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from the other world people. So I was needs left to my own unaided efforts, and the thought of flight before explanation was even then in my mind. But I said to myself, "You are in for it now." And feeling my way along the tunnel, I found the noise of machinery grew louder. Presently the walls fell away from me, and I came to a large open space. In striking another match, I saw that entered a vast arched cavern which was stretched into utter darkness beyond the range of my light. The view I had of it was much like the one of a burning match. Necessarily, my memory is vague. Great shapes of big machines rose out of the dimness, cast grotesque black shadows, in which dim spectral warlocks sheltered from the glare. The place, by the by, was very stuffy and oppressive, and the faint hilt of freshly shed blood was in the air. Some way down the central vista was a little table of white metal, laid with what seemed a meal. The Murlocs, at any rate, were carnivores. Even at the time, I remembered wondering what large animal could have survived to furnish the red joint I saw. It was very indistinct. The heavy smell, the vague, unmeaning shapes, the obscure figures lurking in the shadows, only waiting for the darkness to come again. Then the match burnt down and stung my fingers as it fell, a ringing red spot in the blackness. I have thought since how particularly ill-equipped I was for such an experience. When I had started with the time machine, I had started with the absurd assumption that the men of the future would certainly be indefinitely ahead of ourselves with their appliances. I had come out without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke. At times I missed tobacco frightfully. Even without matches, if only I had thought of Karok, I could have flashed that glimpse of the underworld in a second, and examined it at leisure. But I stood there with only the weapons and powers that nature had endowed me with: hands, feet, teeth. These and 4 safety matches that still remained to me. I was afraid to push my way among in the machinery in the dark. And if it was only with my last glimpse of light I discovered my store of matches was running low. It had never occurred to me that until the moment that there was a need to economize them, and that I had wasted almost half the box in astonishing the overworlds, to whom fire was a novelty. Now, as I say, I had 4 left. While I stood in the dark, a hand touched mine. A lank finger came feeling over my face, and I was sensible to a particularly unpleasant odor. I fancied I heard the breathing of a crowd of the most dreadful little beings about me. I felt the box of matches in my hand gently disengaged, and their hands began plucking at my clothing. The sense of these unseen creatures examining me was indescribably unpleasant. The sudden realization of my ignorance of their ways of doing came home to me very vividly in the darkness. I shouted at them as loudly as I could. They started away, and then I could feel them approaching me again. They clutched at me more boldly, whispering odd sounds to each other. I shivered violently and shouted again, rather discordantly. This time they were not so seriously alarmed, and they made a queer laughing noise as they came back at me. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I determined to strike another match and escape under protection of its glare. I did so, eking out the flicker with a scrap of paper from my pocket. I made good my retreat to the narrow tunnel, but I had scarce entered this way when my light had blown out, and in the darkness I could feel the Morlocks rustling like wind among leaves and pattering like rain as they hurried after me. In a moment I was clutched by several hands. There was no mistaking that they were trying to haul me back. I struck another light and waved it in their dazzled faces. You can scarce imagine how nauseatingly inhuman they looked. Those pale, chinless, and great, lidless, pinkish gray eyes as they stared in their blindness and bewilderment. But I did not stay to look. I promise you I retreated again, and then my second match had ended. I struck my third. It almost burnt through when I reached the opening into the shaft. I lay down on the edge for the throb of the great pump below me giddy. Then I felt sideways for the projecting hooks, and as I did so, my feet were grasped from behind, and I was violently tugged backward. I lit my last match in it and continuously went out, but I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and kicked violently. I disengaged myself from the clutches of the Murlocs, and was speedily clambering up the shaft while they stayed peering and blinking at me. All but one of those little wrenches, who followed me for some way, and well nigh secured my boot as a trophy. The climb seemed meaningful to me. With the vast 20 or 30 feet of it, a deadly nausea came upon me. I had the greatest difficulty in keeping my hold. At last few yards was a frightful struggle against this faintness. Several times my head swam, and I felt all the sensations of falling. At last, however, I got over the well mouth somehow, and staggered out of the ruin into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and clean. Then I remembered how, when kissing my hands and ears, and the voices of other only, then for a time I was insensible.